Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CBIA's program on essential skills for supervisors and managers. I'm Diane Mokrisky, HR and Employment Law Counsel here at CBIA. For those of you who work at CBIA member companies, I may have spoken to you or one of your colleagues as part of our HR hotline services. But today we're really fortunate to be joined by several experts who are going to help us navigate our way through some of the more difficult areas that managers and supervisors face. Before we begin, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to our sponsor for today's webinar, Clifton Larson Allen, otherwise known as CLA. CLA is a professional services firm, which includes an advisory team of about 20 HR professionals who offer a full range of HR services with flexible costs and scalable support. So you can find out more information about CLA and information about their HR services at their website, which is claconnect.com. So all registered attendees are going to receive via email within a day or two a copy of the written materials that we're using during this webinar, as well as a link to a recorded video. So keep an eye out for your inbox for that. And during the course of the webinar, if you have any questions, you can submit those through the Q&A and we'll try to address them at the close of each presentation. So today we're going to focus on 3 specific skills that good managers master. The first one is interviewing. And this is really so much more than just asking simple questions about employment history. A skilled interviewer can not only identify the candidates that fit specifically for an open position, but they're really good at finding candidates that'll meet your company's mission. Good interviewers also can appreciate the difference between knowing what not to ask and knowing what questions to ask. So we're going to cover both of those issues in that topic. The second skill that we're going to cover is effective communication. We're going to do both retention and recruiting. And so this is the managerial skill, though, that should really combat the flood of resignations that we've been seeing. An effective manager communicates expectations and sets reliable goals, gives feedback, but also accepts feedback just as easily, and sets the tone for the work site as a whole. So this type of manager with this skill can really fight attrition, which is the focus of that second session. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to recognize and respond to behavioral red flags or warning signs that your employees might be showing you. So specifically, we're talking about what types of behaviors might be indicative of mental illness or a tendency towards violence. And so we're going to discuss how to approach your interactions with those employees, how to start what might be an awkward discussion in that regard. And this is likely an area where managers have the least expertise. And so we know that can be daunting. And we'll try to cover a little bit of self-care for you, the managers, as well as how to deal with that part of managerial skills. So just these 3 subject areas, right, in a myriad of skills that managers have to have, they really highlight how complicated your jobs are, managing not just the company operations, but all the personalities that come with it. So we're going to do our best to cover all those to help you, both new managers and seasoned ones. So let's start with our first topic, which is effective interviewing. We've got Nick Daukas, who's the managing partner at KardasLarson, which is a human resources and business consulting firm. Nick has over 30 years of operations, human resources leadership, and consulting experience under his belt. He's joined by Nick Zaino, who's a partner at Carmody Torrance Sandak Hennessey. Nick practices primarily in the areas of labor and employment law and has extensive experience counseling, representing, and training employers. So Nick, welcome. Good morning. Thanks for joining us, and take it away.
All right, I'm Nick 1, I guess.
Yes,
thank
you can be Nick 1.
Thanks, Diane. So yes, just real quickly. So I'm with KardasLarson, and we've been around for almost 20 years, 2004, and we drive, we help small to mid-sized organizations drive their HR solutions. So everything from strategic to tactical, and we find ourselves being on site with a client, on call, retain, project-based services, and the 6 main areas we do our work in: general HR and compliance, training and development, organizational effectiveness, which would be examples, could be employee surveys, performance management programs, succession planning, talent acquisition and retention. We do compensation work, compensation design, market pricing, and coaching. So just a quick intro of who we are. So effective interviewing. 3 things I'm hoping that I can, that this presentation will help all of you who are listening in and watching, is learn how effective interviewing is really, it's a critical and valuable tool for managers and supervisors. I'm going to I'll be introducing a structured interview approach, and the specific model that I'll spend time on as far as structured interview is behavioral interview. And some of you may know this, some of you may use it, but I think it's the go-to model when we talk about interviewing, and specifically structured interview. So just where are you at today? What's, setting the stage of why this is so important? So, unemployment is really low, 3.5%. Economists call that pretty much at full employment. So there aren't that many candidates out there that are looking for jobs. Connecticut is a little higher, but still pretty low historically, 4.1%. There's an astronomical number of jobs that are open across the country, 11 million. That is just phenomenal, how many open jobs there are. And in Connecticut, there's a fair amount of jobs open, approximately 100,000. So these are difficult and daunting indicators of the type of environment we're all in when we talk about sourcing, recruiting, attracting, and hiring quality candidates. And then the last piece, which has been around, we've been talking about this for at least a couple of years, the Great Resignation. It's just kind of the workplace is changing. The workers are everything from commanding higher rates of pay to different working conditions, whether it's hybrid or remote working. Then we have, the gig economy is coming into play, with a lot of workers have decided to be their own bosses, be independent contractors. And then there's a fair amount over the last 2 or 3 years, especially, where you have a lot of workers have decided to retire, maybe retire a little earlier than they anticipated. So all of those elements really have driven this Great Resignation, and that has really put pressure on having good quality candidates, having a fair amount of them out there to choose from for employers. And so, as we talk about this, what are some things that you can try to, increase your skills to try to choose the best candidates you can coming in the door? And hence, we're talking about effectively interviewing. So introducing what I think is the best assessment to determine future employees in your organization, and that's structured interviewing. So why is it preferred? It helps predict how candidates will perform once they join the team. You'll hear me maybe say this once or twice, but you've heard this term, interviewing is an art, not a science, but we can certainly improve that ability to really assess candidates better by using this method. So it helps predict, it prevents non-job related questions to be asked. Questions that interviewers really should be focusing their time on are questions that help them determine if a candidate can do their job at the organization, that they can fit the culture of the organization. So any other kinds of non-job related questions are really, it doesn't help that interviewer determine it. It prevents potentially discriminatory questions, illegal questions to be asked, and Nick will kind of talk about that a little bit more later. And it also assesses the competencies as well as job-related skills, which is the main piece that you're trying to assess. So let's just discuss why a traditional or an unstructured approach is, and comparing it to that structured approach. So a traditional model is straightforward questions with no link to any specific job requirements, or maybe not that many links. Questions that pose what-if situations that a quick thinking interviewee shouldn't have trouble answering. What if this were to happen? How would you handle that? It can lead to questions and answers which have no connection to past experience, and that is kind of the foundation of this behavioral interviewing model, is trying to determine what someone has done in the past and how that can be a good indicator of how they will perform in those situations in the future. So examples, describe your strengths and weaknesses. A well-prepared interviewee can easily answer that question. But what does that have to do with how they did things in the past, and how that would be a good indicator of how they would work for you as an employer in the future? Describe a typical work week, another kind of a traditional type question. And then a traditional model is only about 10% predictive. It's an art, not a science, but we can certainly have a much higher predictive rate in interviewing to determine and assess if that candidate has a good chance of being successful for you. So I'm going to spend some time and introduce this behavioral interview model. Past behavior of an applicant is really what this model focuses on. So it's determining what their behavior has been in the past, situations that they have found themselves in, tasks that they have done in the past, that if you were to ask specific questions around that and be able to get that information from them, that they will give you a good feel that likely in a given situation working for you, that's how they would handle that kind of a task or situation. So it's questions focused on job-specific skills and competencies, questions which require the applicant to share how they responded to or handled a specific situation in the past. Helps evaluate specific work skills. It also helps evaluate functional or transferable skills, things like managing, developing, and communicating that can span across any industry, multiple jobs. So that's important. And it helps to evaluate self-management skills, personal characteristics, such as being a team player. So this is kind of leading up to why the structured interview and the behavioral interview model specifically, I think is the go-to choice. So taking it to another level is the STAR method is the method I like that I use for behavioral interviewing. So it's an acronym, and it's building what I call building stars. So when you prepare for an interview and when you ask questions, it's developing these questions in such a way where you will ask the candidate, tell me about a situation or a task in the past, what actions you took, what were the results, and that is what building the star is. So it's an example. Tell me of a time when you had to solve a difficult work problem, and you ask the candidate to let you know that specific work problem. What action or actions did you take? What were the results? And also you can ask, or if maybe the action they took wasn't successful, what did you learn from it? So that they can take that and learn and create different solutions for the future. So the whole goal is to ask questions about how a candidate handled something in the past, a difficult situation, a difficult employee, a challenging client or customer, how they handled a situation in the past or a task, and what actions they took and what were the results. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to that, but this type of an interviewing model really, to be successful, really requires when a interviewer asks a question, it requires a little bit of time, a minute or two, to allow the candidate to recall something in the past, a situation or past, and what they did. And that's okay. You'll hear me use the term silence is good. That's fine. Let the candidate think. There isn't any, silence is not awkward in this situation. And then using behavioral interviewing, in the evaluation phase after the interview is critical. It really doesn't focus on things like education and experience, at least on the cover, because you kind of have that information already. You have their resume, so you know where they've worked, how long they were there, maybe education, that kind of thing. What it focuses is really on is the how and the why, their experience, what they did, how they did it, why they took certain actions. And it's about 55% predictive. So it's 45% stronger predictive behavior, predictive of future behavior for candidates. So it's yes, it's not 100%. Interviewing is not a perfect science, like I mentioned before, but it is a much higher predictive. It's predictive of future behavior at a much higher level than a traditional interview. So what are the main steps with interviewing? So this is with any kind of interviewing, but again, with the behavioral is a little bit more detailed. So preparation. So obviously, knowing what the job entails, what's the content of the role, what are the responsibilities, what are the qualifications. So having an updated job description or position profile is really critical, and having that in advance and prepared for the interview is critical. Identify those skills and competencies and other components that will help a candidate be successful in the job. What are the behavioral elements for this position? Maybe consider, if applicable, why did previous employees leave this position? Has the position kind of changed? Will it, or if there isn't, if there aren't any previous, if it's a new position, trying to understand what are the key elements for this to be successful. And especially early on, that assimilation piece of helping a new employee assimilate to the job, but also to the organization. So it's looking at that cultural piece, looking at how they will interact with others. And then obviously have that resume, have that employment application, and any other data you receive from however you're sourcing candidates. Maybe it's from job boards, etc. Having all that, preparing that, using all of that to help you craft questions. Then that's the last piece, is developing your questions to help you assess if the candidate will be successful, will be able to assimilate early on into the organization and into the job. And then I like to use just a quick format when I'm actually doing interviews. It's simple: give, get, give. So give the candidate some basic information about the job, maybe things about the organization, like the strategies, and maybe some changes, recent changes or focuses for the organization. And then get is the interview asks questions to assess whether the candidate has the skills, the competencies, etc. And I underline this should be the largest component of the interview. All too often, I've been in interviews where the interviewer does most of the talking, and that it should be the opposite. The interviewee should be doing most of the talking, because if the questions are really quality questions, that's the information you'll be getting. So letting the interviewee answer questions, pause, think of situations in the past to help answer that. And then at the last give is just giving some basic information, maybe more information about the company, next steps about, the process, the hiring process, if, when the candidate will hear back from you on next steps. That's the give, get, give. And then critical pieces in this in interviewing is trying to put the candidate at ease. And that includes letting the candidate know this format you'll be using, the interview format, letting the candidate know that you're going to be asking questions. You're going to ask them to think back in the past, come up with situations or tasks that they have been involved with to help answer a question. So really kind of putting them at ease, letting them know the format, letting them know that you'll be taking notes, that you'll be asking follow-up questions to their answers, letting them know how it will work. Answer this, ask the same make sure you solicit the same content with each candidate. So you're making sure that you're comparing apples to apples when you're looking at different candidates. Ask any additional questions, any follow-up questions. That's an important piece. Don't ask, but with regard to follow-up questions, don't lead the candidate. I put the example here, you're willing to work long hours when needed, right? That's an easy response that the candidate will give you, a positive response. So don't lead them. Provide details about next steps on the hiring decision. I mentioned, kind of alluded to that already, but that would be an important piece to cover. Avoid illegal questions. Nick will cover those at the end when I'm done. And I also, at the end of my presentation, I have kind of a cheat sheet that you can use along those lines as well. And then end on a positive note, letting the candidate know timing for next steps, final decision process. Tell the candidate you thought, your time together was well spent, really kind of end it on a real good positive note. So, so it's a good wind up for the interview. I kind of alluded to some of these things already, but really important to start out by setting the stage, explain and introduce the method, the technique you're going to use. Stop talking. Remember what I said earlier, interviewers should do less talking and more listening during this process. Silence is good. It's okay to allow a minute or two after a question has been asked, so the candidate can recall back to a situation or a task in the past that they can use to answer a question. And then keep probing. It's fine after the candidate has a question, comes up with an answer. If you have a follow-up question, it's okay to do that. Keep probing with follow-up questions during this process. Evaluate each interviewee's candidacy while it's still fresh in your mind. We all have busy days. Don't move on and then 3 days goes by and you're trying to recall the interviews that you had. So evaluate it right away. And then be aware of common rating biases that we all have when we're trying to rate and trying to determine candidates and stronger candidates versus weaker candidates. Here are some common rating biases that happen. One is the halo effect. So what is it? So overrating someone based on their background, their experience. They have great experience in a particular industry that you're in, or something along those lines. So you're overrating them based on that versus really asking those specific detailed questions to determine how they will perform in a given situation in the future. Recency, under or overvaluing short-term performance. So, looking at their full history, for instance, asking questions, not just on their most recent job, but also looking at maybe previous jobs. Leniency, not evaluating the candidate accurately because maybe they're a bit nervous or anxious, giving them a little extra plus when you should be asking them specific questions across the board for each candidate. Any personal feelings, candidate is a very nice person, very kind person, just allowing that to not influence your assessment. Don't make any premature decisions. Early on, maybe the first part of the interview, the candidate's doing really well in your mind. Don't begin to assess that they are someone you're going to bring back for another interview. Complete the interview. There may be pieces later on that they may not have great responses to. And then first impressions, don't over focus on presence or personality. Someone who has a strong personality, someone who's extremely positive, someone who's very personable, really key in on the key skills and competencies that are required for that job, for that person to be successful in the job. So some common rater biases to be aware of. Some sample questions. And I've kind of broken this out into major groups. So as far as communication goes, give me an example of a time when you were able to successfully communicate with another person, even when you and that individual may not have worked well together previously. How did you handle the situation? What obstacles or difficulties did you face? How did you deal with them? In order to assess how you deal with conflict at work, give me an example of a time in the past when you had to deal with a conflict at work. What was the situation? What action did you take? And what were the results? The area of planning and organizing. Describe a time when you had many projects or assignments due at the same time. What steps did you take to get them all done? What were the results? Under leadership, tell me about a team project when you had to take the lead or take charge of the project. What did you do? How did you do it? What was the result? Interpersonal skills. Describe a situation in which you were able to use persuasion to successfully convince someone to see things your way. What steps did you take and what were the results? So those are some sample questions to get a feel for how these are put together. Kind of the main competencies that they're focusing on. Here's my cheat sheet at the end that Nick will kind of take it, but some of the main categories of being careful, what you can, what you cannot, or maybe it's not advisable to ask, and any comments along the way. So those are, I just included these for your use later on to help. And that is my piece. So thank you. I didn't know if there was any questions I could answer now, or we'll do that towards the end. I'll let you.
Yeah, before we get to Nick Zaino,
Sure.
a couple questions did come in for you, Nick. One was,
Okay.
how do you factor in nervousness during an interview? How do you, like, how much strength should you give that? Does that mean that the person can't do the job, or how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so great question, very common situation. So, that's the kind of trying to put the candidate at ease, trying to not just explain what the interview is, but also maybe talk about, oh, I see you worked here. I'm familiar with that. Try to build that rapport, trying to put them at ease. But that does happen, and the interviewer can try to put them at ease by building that rapport, having some common job related kinds of questions and conversations.
So you mentioned that you're trying to keep your questions job related, but at the same time, put the person at ease. So does that mean that you really shouldn't be asking questions like, in an attempt to calm them down, maybe you should not be asking like, well, how do you spend your free time? What do you do on the weekends? Just to kind of get to know them and see if you'll get along, maybe.
Yeah, so it's okay at the very beginning to maybe ask something along those lines, but the focus really is, and it's valuable time. An interview is valuable time out of everyone's schedule. So the real focus is to job related, organization related, industry related kinds of questions.
Okay. So one question came in having to do with company culture. You focused a lot on task-related questions. How did you do things in the past? How would you do things if I gave you this project? What kind of questions can you ask that'll help a person determine if they really fit within the company culture, that don't, like, if you're not focusing just on tasks?
So a great example would be kind of a project that you talked about. So, in that particular organization's culture, is it the type where the project lead, interfaces with other groups to try to get quality information and to try to be transparent? Is that the company culture? Or is it different? Is it that particular project, is finite as far as a certain path without including other groups? So if the culture is transparency, teamwork, across or the organization, and a candidate kind of answers that question along those lines, there's a good chance that they, at least in that situation, could be a fit for the culture.
Okay. And then the last question has to do with tests and assessments. Where do those fit in? Is that only if you pass the interview, or is that part of the interview? How do you do that?
So I'll answer that a little bit, and then maybe Nick can take it from his perspective. But
Okay.
A specific job task, having someone do a particular, let's say they need to use Excel, having them do an Excel spreadsheet, and every candidate is doing the same task to see how they would put together. Let's say they need to use pivot tables. Okay, here's an example. Can they do that? The whole piece on personality and all of that, I'm not a proponent of that. It gets very complicated and whatnot, but it's okay to do a specific job related as long as everyone is getting that same, I don't want to use the word test, that same task to do. And maybe Nick can shine more information on that.
Yeah, Nick, so before you start your presentation, I'll throw that question to you, kind of
Sure.
a similar question. I know we have a lot of manufacturing clients out there. Can an employer actually say to a candidate, here, go deburr this. We want to see if you can actually, you say you can do it, but we want to see that you can actually do that.
Any test that's, as long as it's not medical test, you can ask that an individual perform a task or demonstrate that they can perform a task. Obviously, it should be job related, and you should build that in for every job applicant. So you don't only ask maybe the employee who seems older, maybe you're worried that the person can do the task or not. And so you're going to have that person demonstrate how they will deburr a machine, but you're not going to ask somebody who is much younger. So you can have a non-medical related task that you ask all applicants to perform. It should be job related. And then I'll touch on it later. If you do perform any kind of medical test, that needs to be done post offer. So after a conditional offer of employment is made.
Okay, great. So why don't you get started with your slides?
Thank you, Diane, and thank you, Nick. I guess I'm Nick too for this morning. And so good morning, everyone. I'm going to just do a high level sort of legal overview of some of the landmines, some of the things you need to be cognizant of during the interview process. And I'll start with Connecticut's ban the box law and use of criminal history. There are three things that I really want to touch on. One is the ban the box law. Two is the use of erased criminal records. And then three is just when you make decisions based on somebody's criminal history. And so Connecticut, like a number of other states, an increasing number of states, has what's called ban the box law. And essentially that prohibits employers from inquiring about arrests, criminal charges, or convictions on the initial employment application. So to the extent you, and you should, require your job applicants to complete an employment application form, you should remove any questions about criminal history, arrests, convictions, unless you fall within one of those two exceptions that are on the screen. You can still inquire about somebody's criminal history and specifically focus on convictions after the initial employment application is filled out. So you can inquire during the interview process or at some later point in the hiring process. You simply cannot do so on the employment application form. The second law in Connecticut that I wanted to mention is a law that essentially states that any job, you cannot ask as an employer any job applicant to disclose the existence of any arrest or criminal charge or conviction, the records of which have been erased. And so if an individual has had criminal conviction or a criminal charge against them erased, it's as though they were never arrested. And so you cannot ask that somebody disclose that, and you cannot base an employment decision on any records that have been erased. In fact, if you do ask at some point in the hiring process whether or not somebody has a conviction or any kind of criminal history, you need to add language that advises that job applicant that they do not need to disclose any records that have been erased. And then the last point I want to make on criminal history is simply, it is a balancing act. You get, on the one hand, you have concerns about hiring individuals who are fit, who don't pose safety concerns, don't have any criminal violent histories that you're worried about. You balance that with the EOC's concerns that if you're too aggressive in denying employment to those with criminal histories, it may have a disparate impact on certain groups. And so, it's best to have some guidelines, about the types of criminal convictions that will be a bar to employment. To the extent you can do that, it's better. Make them, of course, we've been talking about job related, and we're going to continue to do that. Try to make the convictions that are going to be a bar to employment job related, and don't just adopt a policy that says anyone with a felony will not be hired, or anybody with any kind of conviction on their record will not be hired. That may be too broad and may have a disparate impact on certain protected groups. So it is a balancing act, and it's sort of a case-by-case situation, I think. But a thoughtful set of parameters should be helpful in that regard. The next topic I wanted to touch on is Connecticut's pay equity law. Connecticut, again, like a number of states, an increasing number of states, has a law that went into effect on January 1st, 2019. And it prohibits an employer from asking either directly or through a third party, a recruiter, about a prospective employee's wage or salary history, unless, of course, that person volunteers the information. So again, you go back to your job application form, and it should not include any questions or ask the applicant to disclose their prior salary history. I know many employment application forms did request that information. And so you can ask about elements of somebody's compensation. So for example, if you are hiring somebody for a sales position and you want to ask about whether they were paid on a commission basis, that's okay. Where you paid a salary plus a commission, bonuses, per diem or piecemeal, piece rate, I should say. You can ask components of compensation. You just can't ask about specific salary history. And you can ask if somebody has salary expectations, and they may give you their salary expectations, but not ask any information where you're trying to elicit their salary history. And then, if you're going to have supervisors, I'm sure you will, and managers do interviewing, make sure that they preserve employment at will. You go to great lengths as employers to preserve the employment at will relationship, which allows the maximum flexibility for employers to end the employment relationship at any time for any reason, with or without cause. That's sort of the standard employment at will language. You include it in employment application forms, you include it in job offer letters, you include it in your employee handbooks. And the last thing you want is your interviewers saying things that undercut employment at will, and they're doing it to entice that person to come and work for you. So things like, do a good job and we'll take care of you. Employees are never terminated without cause or unless there's a good reason. You have job security as long as you get good performance review and so on. Some of that, while that may be, that person may have that feeling, that personal feeling, there are other ways for an interviewer to convey things that they like about the company, the culture that they like about the company, what they find to be favorable, but not undermine employment at will. And so there are cases on that, and you just want to make sure that your interviewers are aware of those questions not to ask. It's also good practice, and I think Nick mentioned this, to have sort of a standard set of questions so that folks don't fall into this trap. It's also good for DEI, promoting principles of DEI, to have a standard set of questions. So just some ideas to train your management. And of course, questions should be job related and avoid asking personal types of questions. So let's try to think of a test you could use to figure out whether or not a question is proper or not. And I don't know, I haven't tested this obviously, but if you ask a question that you cannot base a decision on, it's probably not a good question, right? And so we're going to go through a whole bunch of those. And I think Nick had a good slide that sort of highlights some of that. So if you're asking a question, again, that you can't base a decision on, then it's probably not a good question. And so there are some laws where it's specifically illegal to ask a particular type of question. And then there are times when it's just improper, or it's not advisable, or it's not a best practice. And so Connecticut has a law that says it's illegal to request or require information from an employee or a job applicant relating to, and I'll focus on a couple of the ones that I think are most relevant, childbearing age or plans, pregnancy, family responsibilities. And so if you're concerned about whether or not somebody can meet the demands of the position, whether they can work a certain number of hours, it's better to set the expectations of the work hours and ask if the individual can meet it, or in a more appropriate way along the lines that Nick suggested. But it is not okay to ask, how many kids do you have? And do you coach their soccer team? Now you're asking personal questions, right? And it's more, they're not really job-related questions, and those kind of things can actually run contrary to Connecticut's law. The other ones there, it's in the law, but I hope you don't ask anybody about their reproductive system or birth control methods. But if you were inclined to do so, it's actually illegal under Connecticut law. And so types of improper questions. Again, these aren't questions that you can base a decision on. What is your maiden name? And I know there was a question maybe before that came up, or somebody had asked, can you do that for purposes of a background check? And I think the answer there is yes, right? You're doing it for a specific purpose. Typically, a background check is done post-offer. They can be done pre-offer, but typically they're done post-offer, and I think that's probably the better practice. Other improper questions: are you single? Do you wish to be addressed as Ms., Mrs., or Miss? These are all questions that elicit information upon which you cannot base a decision. What is your native language? What is that accent? Other types of improper questions. Where are you from? Is that a particular name from a particular national origin? What are your thoughts about labor unions? Are you a member of any clubs or organizations? What is your religion? These are improper questions. Not necessarily illegal in and of themselves, but not questions on which you can base a decision. Permissible questions. And I'm not saying these are good questions. These are just permissible. Are you willing to relocate? The job requires overtime. Is that a problem for you? What hours can you work? Can you work on weekends? What hours and days can you work? These are all job-related types of questions. And maybe they're more appropriate in an employment application form or in a pre-screen. But these are all questions about the person's ability to actually do the job. Other questions that I think are permissible: have you ever been terminated from prior employment? And then the follow-up: if so, why? That is a proper question. Asking about gaps in employment and short periods of employment. We've noticed, or I noticed on your resume that you've had 10 jobs in 10 years, right? That's a fair question. Have you ever worked here before? Asking about prior work experience, job duties, qualifications, certifications, and so on. You should ask this question at some point, the last one there, whether you do it in the employment application form, whether you do it during the interview process, or whether you do it in an offer letter. But find out if the individual that you're interviewing has any agreements that they may have signed, non-compete, non-solicit confidentiality agreements that restrict their ability to work for you. The last thing you want is to go through an entire interview process, extend an offer, only to find out that they have a non-compete and they're not able to work for you. It's okay to ask, are you 18 or older? You should not ask questions that look to elicit somebody's age, and there are some questions there that I won't go through, but those all kind of ask or lead to somebody disclosing how old they are. The ADA, and so this one and the question that came up earlier really falls under the ADA. An employer may not ask a disability-related question or questions or conduct any medical examination until after a conditional real job offer is made. And so that's sort of the bright line rule. Cannot ask any disability related question. What is a disability related question? It's any question that is likely to elicit information about a medical impairment. And so you can't ask any type of question along those lines pre-offer. So things that you cannot ask. Do you need an accommodation to perform this job? So that is not okay, because the person, if they have a medical impairment, might have to say, yes, I do. And so that is a question that is likely to elicit information about an impairment if somebody has one. How many sick days did you use? Have you ever filed a workers' compensation claim? You know, you're not going to ask what medications have you been taking? Have you ever been addicted to drugs? Again, I don't think those are questions that you would ask, but any family medical issues. It is okay to ask pre-offer, can you perform the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? And so sometimes I've seen where employers will ask that question and then they'll put a box, right? A box, you know, check with or check without. You can't do that because, again, that person who has to check the box, yes, I can do it without an accommodation, that, you know, somebody may have to check with an accommodation and have to thereby disclose an impairment. Do you need a reasonable accommodation for the hiring process? That's okay. If a disability is obvious, the person is sitting across from you and they obviously have a disability, typically a physical disability, it's okay to ask at that point what type of accommodation they might need in order to do the job. Can you meet the attendance and overtime requirements? And I don't think you'll ask that last question, but do you currently use or have you ever used illegal drugs? The reason that's okay is it doesn't require them to disclose necessarily an impairment. Post-offer, you can have, at that point, you can conduct medical tests. You can ask questions that are medical types of questions, as long as all applicants in that job category are asked the same question and subject to the same test. So as I mentioned earlier, if you perform any kind of medical test, everybody should be asked to perform that same medical test. It needs to be kept confidential. And of course, that medical test that you ask individuals to perform needs to be job related and consistent with business necessity. So if you're asking, you know, everybody after they're extended a conditional offer of employment and they're being hired for a clerical role, they'll be sitting down, it's very sedentary. And to give you a ridiculous example, you ask them to perform some sort of physical exercise that has absolutely nothing to do with sitting at a desk. That is not job related and consistent with business necessity. And then I just want to finish up and then be open to any questions. You know, some general tips for interviewing, and I think these are things that hopefully are intuitive, but may not be that way for some of your managers. Be careful about small talk. And you know, the person earlier, the question was asked, you know, what do you do when somebody's anxious or nervous? And I do think it's good to get that person to sort of settle down a little bit, but be careful about going down a rabbit hole. And sometimes you don't initiate it when you're doing the interviewing. For example, somebody will tell you all about their medical history, or tell you all about their family and you know, where they're from, and some things that you really aren't all that interested in or cannot base any employment decision on. I think what you want to do there is, instead of go down that rabbit hole and engaging, try to steer that interview back to questions that are job related and are appropriate. Take careful notes. You know, your notes are discoverable. If there's ever a question about why did you interview this person over the other person, you know, it's always very helpful to have some good notes to support the hiring decision. You know, we talked a little bit about asking a standard set of questions that helps to eliminate bias. It helps ensure that proper questions are being asked. And then document your hiring decision. You know, why in fact did you hire this individual over the others? Many times it's not well documented, and that can be really difficult if a complaint is later filed and interviewers don't really remember all the people that they interviewed, and, you know, just remember that they liked the person that they in fact interviewed. So if you can document it, it is way better and much more helpful in a legal proceeding. So with that, we'll leave a little bit of time to just sort of open it up for any questions that may come in, or any other questions that folks have.
All right, so I'm going to start with a question that I think you and I, Nick, answered about 150 times last year. And that was, can we require vaccination, or can we ask about vaccination?
So yes, the EEOC has made it clear that asking whether or not somebody has the COVID vaccine is not a question that is likely to elicit information about an impairment. And so the EOC has taken that position. It's still in their Q&A. And so, yes, you could ask about vaccination status.
Okay, so let's go to background investigations. One question was, can you give examples of types of felonies or misdemeanors that would be irrelevant, or maybe talk about both, irrelevant and relevant, when you're taking those into consideration? And this person is specifically asking about a warehouse job, so probably not finances. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so, I think it will differ on a employer to employer and position to position basis. And so for a warehouse job, maybe it's convictions having to do with theft, where there is an element of trust. Maybe they're handling products that they're entrusted to ensure that they're not lost or stolen. So I would think that any conviction related to theft, maybe violent felony type convictions would also be relevant. Focus on, and again, it's not just, I would look at everything. I would look at when that conviction happened. Is it something that happened 15 years ago, or is it something that happened, 15 minutes ago? Like, I think that's very relevant. Is it do you see a pattern? What was the level of the conviction? So it's very difficult to kind of answer that, without getting into all those different details. And again, I think it differs from position to position.
Okay. Another question is, often we have people take a candidate out to lunch. And so do all those rules about the interview still apply? The lunch is so much less formal, but you're still trying to be really careful about the questions that you ask and the information you elicit?
So the short answer is yes. I mean, any information you get before you extend an offer, and before that person is hired, any information that you get can be questioned as to whether or not you based a decision on that. And so if you go to lunch, all the same rules still apply. It's probably a good way to get information, and maybe too much information, but no, all the legal rules would still apply.
Okay. So Nick Daukas, I'm going to throw this one over to you. I think you touched on this to some extent, and I think actually, Nick Zaino, you did as well. But so this is the question about thoughts or strategies around dealing with concerns about their ability to perform work based on issues that it might not be okay to ask about, like family obligations. We did talk about family obligations. You don't want to ask if they have kids. You want to ask if they're available for the right hours, right? But what about, did we talk about gaps in work history? Is that relevant still if there's a big gap?
Sure, yes. So, asking a question about that to let them fill in why is there a 3-year gap? That's perfectly fine.
Okay.
And, I think what I would say is, don't assume that the candidate will answer it kind of in a negative piece. They may have a really great reason, and that reason, although maybe they didn't work, but they were able to apply skills that are transferable. Kind of look at it like there's don't look at it negatively. Look at it like there's probably a good reason, and that there could be transferable skills that would be a plus.
Yeah, I think particularly with COVID over the last couple of years, that's probably going to come up a little bit more with people not having work. I wonder, though, what do you think about women having a gap because they took a couple of years to raise their kids? I mean, is that going to present a problem if that elicits the answer, well, I had a kid, and so that's what I've been doing the past couple of years?
No, I would say no. You want to look at the entire candidate's work history, and look at it in totality. It's kind of like, one of my rating biases, don't look at just the most recent, look at the entire history.
Okay. Nick Zaino, let's talk a little bit about gender. The question is, are we allowed to ask the gender to be used toward the individual? So for example, are we asking people for their pronouns?
Yeah, again, I don't see why that would be a relevant question. And maybe there is some bona fide reason why gender is relevant. But in fact, I think the best practice is to go back and review your employment application form and eliminate any question on that form that would elicit gender. I don't think that's a relevant, it's gender. You can't base a decision based on gender. And so I don't think it would be a good question to ask somebody to disclose or identify their gender or their gender identity.
I guess I was thinking it might just be a matter of practicality, like you don't want to misgender them. But I suppose if you're thinking that through, if you're talking directly to someone, you're probably not going to use their pronoun unless it's a group interview, and you might say to your colleague, well, she just said, or what do you think about would you have something to follow up what she just said? Do you know what I mean? Like at some point you might need to know their pronoun.
You might. I mean, I would still not make that a standard kind of question that you ask during the hiring process. If there's a reason, and there may be reasons for affirmative action and EEO purposes that you need to track that sort of thing, and that is different. There's a whole way about the best practice for asking applicants to self-identify so you can track for affirmative action purposes. But I don't think I would ask somebody to identify their preferred pronouns just generally during the hiring process.
Okay. So Nick Zaino, you talked in your presentation a little bit about ethnicity and questions that you cannot ask. When if the issue is their ability to speak English, let's say you're hiring someone for a telephone job where you need to be able to speak clearly. Is that a job-related requirement that someone needs to speak English fluently and speak it articulately, for example, without a strong accent?
Yeah, so I think that is for certain positions that is definitely a legitimate job requirement. If you are going to be doing customer service, you need to be able to speak English fluently enough where the person on the other side of that phone call is able to understand, what is being communicated. I think that is a legitimate job requirement. And so, but if somebody does speak fluently but has an accent, that is not a reason to deny employment, simply because English may not be their primary language, as long as they can speak fluently enough that the individual on the other side of the phone call can understand what they're saying. So again, that becomes a bit subjective, and maybe there are tests out there for gauging that. But I think that can be a legitimate job requirement for a position.
Okay. Going back to disability related questions, this is a very specific type of employer. This is a question that came in. I work for an agency that regularly employs people with disabilities while also providing support services for those people. Based on the work that they do, are we allowed to have them self-identify their disability during the application process, or does even that type of employer need to wait until post-offer?
Oh, so that's a good question. It's very specific. Obviously, the purpose of the EEOC's rule, the Americans with Disability Act law, in fact, is to not discriminate against individuals that have a disability. And so it sounds like this employer is actively seeking job applicants that have a disability. And so I guess what I think I would say is make it very clear to the applicant that you only are looking to hire, if this is true, individuals with disabilities, and that you ask that person to confirm, because it's required that the person has a disability. But I don't think I would necessarily ask the nature of it until after an offer of employment is made, unless there are certain disabilities that I was going to say that you can't accommodate, but maybe that's too broad. I think I would just stick with off the cuff, just saying to the applicant, we require that you have a disability. That's the whole purpose of our organization. Do you, don't you? And then after post-offer, get into the specifics of what that might be and what they might need as an accommodation.
Okay.
That's my off-the-cuff thought on it.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the most important thing to keep in mind for that type of employer, for everyone really, is that the point is that you can't discriminate, right? And so if that employer is clearly not discriminating, I think the guidelines may be slightly different, right, as you outlined.
Yeah.
Let's just do one more. And Nick Daukas, I'm going to throw this to you. You've touched on this a little bit, but just going back to resumes that highlight extracurricular activities. It's right there in the resume, and maybe it has a little bit to do with, I don't know, what type of personality they have or their skills. Can you ask the candidate about those things on their resume?
So, I would really, it depends on, if they have like a sports, like let's say they really are in sports, if you're in an employer that is in the sports field, maybe you can, but I would really focus in on, is it job related? I think what you see on the resume could be an indicator of someone who is if for lack of another example, sports, maybe that shows that they are, they're driven, and maybe that's a good thing. But, if it really goes back to the job,
Okay.
if it's job related.
Okay. Well, Nick Daukas and Nick Zaino, thank you very much. That was very helpful. Lots of information there. So remember, Nick Daukas is at CardasLarson. Nick Zaino is at Carmody Torrance Sandak and Hennessey. So if you have follow-up issues for them, you can contact them directly. We're going to take a 10-minute break. And so everyone grab a cup of coffee, and we'll be back at 9:45.